Dave Talks Comics, Episode 63, Daredevil Born Again. Dave Talks Comics is a program on the subjects of comic books and cartoons. I talk about comics I have read and cartoons I have watched. I talk from my notes. I don't go panel by panel or scene by scene. I try to do more than just summarize the stories. This program is not spoiler-free. I try not to spoil everything, but in the process of talking about Daredevil Born Again, in this case, I will probably spoil it in some way. In fact, I'm sure I'm going to spoil it in some way. Daredevil Born Again consists of issues 227 to 223, which have cover dates of February 1986 to August of 1986. That's what's in the collection that I bought. I've seen online that there are other collections which also include issue 226. I haven't read that, so I'm not sure what's in that. I believe it was also written and drawn by Frank Miller and David Mazzucchelli. Miller is the writer and Mazzucchelli is the artist. Previously, I had not read this before, just recently when I read it. I had read Miller's earlier run on Daredevil, which he wrote part of that. He wrote, I think, about 2/3 of that, or maybe it was only half. And it was about 30 issues, I believe. And he drew it all. In this case, he's not the artist, but he is the writer. And it's a different kind of story, I'll say. It's a different kind of story. I mean, it's a single story, whereas his previous run was a collection of various stories which introduced all kinds of great concepts. And I first read parts of that run when I was a kid, when it was first coming out. I didn't actually buy and read it, but I had a friend who did, and so I would read his issues. So I can remember reading a lot of those issues, which introduced the whole ninja aspect into it, and you had the Punisher in there. You had the Punisher, Kingpin. Who am I forgetting? Bullseye, Elektra, and a number of other characters, supporting characters. And I really loved that. And it was a great run, and it was a great piece of writing. It was beautifully done. But this is, I don't know. In some ways, I like this better. I mean, certainly as a concise story, and I reread that several years ago, probably 7 or 8 years ago. I still have all 3 of those trades that collect it. I think it's Legends, Frank Miller, Daredevil, Legends, Daredevil, Frank Miller, whatever it is. And it's a great run. It's definitely worth reading. And but anyway, so I had never read Born Again, and it was one of those that I always heard about. It's one of 2 collaborations between Mazzucchelli and Miller, as I understand it. The other one being Batman Year One, which I only recently read for the first time. I think that was a little before I started doing the podcast. So maybe early 2013 or maybe even 2012, something like that was when I first read that. Now, that is basically, I mean, it's a Batman story, but it's Batman. There's really 2 stories there. There's Batman and there is Commissioner Gordon, Jim Gordon. And in some ways it's more of a Jim Gordon story than it is a Batman story, because the Batman aspects of it don't really add as much, I think, as the Jim Gordon aspects do. And I'm going somewhere with this. And where I'm going with this is that this story isn't just a Daredevil story. I mean, Daredevil plays a major role in it, but it's not just his story. It's much more than just his story. And I've thought about this a lot, and I've read through it more than once, not in detail, but I've flipped through it and stopped at important places and reread them. And the way I see it, there's basically 5 threads running through the story. And maybe before I get to that, I should talk a little bit about what the overall story is about. And that's basically Daredevil's identity gets exposed, and the Kingpin finds out, exposed to the Kingpin, not by his own fault, not by Daredevil's own fault, but it gets exposed to the Kingpin, and then the Kingpin does everything he can to take Daredevil down and almost kills him, but Daredevil survives, and in some cases it's probably more accurate to say Matt Murdock survives than Daredevil survives. Because for a good part of the story, he's not in costume. And it's almost more of a Matt Murdock story than it is a Daredevil story, which is kind of interesting when you try and compare that to, when you compare Daredevil to, say, Batman, because Batman often seems like a completely different person when he is in costume as opposed to when he is Bruce Wayne. And I don't think you have quite that same split between Daredevil. I mean, Daredevil really is just in some ways, he's really just Matt Murdock when he's wearing a costume. Now, I'm not an expert on Daredevil. I haven't read much Daredevil other than Frank Miller's Daredevil. I've read a few Silver Age issues. But I really have, and I read Brubaker's run on Daredevil. But other than that, I really haven't read a whole lot of Daredevil, but anyway, getting back to this, so it's basically, the story is about Daredevil's redemption, or his attempt to come back, his rebirth from this crashing fall that he takes at the beginning of the book. And I've got to be honest, the way the story opened, I wasn't really loving it at first, and I think it's because I didn't really understand what the story was doing, what Miller and Mazzucchelli were doing with this story, and where it was going. Because the story begins with Daredevil or Matt Murdock in this downward spiral. Basically, the Kingpin has done what he can to make Matt Murdock look as bad as possible. His landlord is threatening to foreclose on him. The IRS is investigating him. It doesn't look good, and he can't figure out what's going on. He's sure that somebody's behind all this, but basically he's really on edge. The world seems to be against him. He doesn't feel that he can trust anyone. And that's where for almost the first half, there's 7 issues in this collection I got. And for almost the first half of the story, he's in this downward spiral. Now, if the story were just about Matt Murdock, it probably wouldn't be as good. But as I said earlier, as I see it, there are 5 threads in the story. There's 5. And the first one, yes, is Matt Murdock, Daredevil. And it's his story. But it's more than just that. It's also, the second thread would be Karen Page. It's also her story. You've also got her story going through this. She is the one who reveals Matt Murdock's secret identity, or Daredevil's secret identity. And this information gets passed along to the Kingpin. She's strung out. She has worked in porn films. She has a drug habit at this point. She's desperate for a fix, and so she gives up his name. She gives up his identity in an attempt to get more of whatever it is that she's using. And then throughout the rest of the story, you get her attempt to come back, her attempt to make up for what she's done, and that is. It's just as compelling in my mind as Daredevil's story, which is also extremely compelling. So that's 2 threads. The next thread is Ben Urich, and Ben Urich is a reporter for the Daily Bugle who who figured prominent, who played an important part in Miller's previous run on Daredevil, and who is investigating the circumstances that led to Matt Murdock's downfall. And the other interesting thing that you should know about Ben Urich is that he figured out Daredevil's secret identity, and he knows, and Daredevil knows that he knows, and that all happened I think that happened prior to Miller's run, just before Miller's run on Daredevil, or maybe it was during early in Miller's run on Daredevil, but before he started writing it, I think. I'm not sure. I can't remember the exact issue. But so that's the third thread, because you got Ben Urich investigating the circumstances, what happened, and of course, in investigating them, he runs up against some of the Kingpin's people, and the Kingpin doesn't want this stuff revealed, and so he starts putting the pressure on Urich to stop investigating, to shut up, to not say anything, and that's a really compelling part of the story too. I mean, it's a really good story. Okay, so that's three threads: Matt, Karen Page, and Ben Urich, and then the fourth thread is Foggy Nelson and Gloria Breen. And Foggy is, of course, Matt's former, I think they're still partners. They're, law partners. They have a law office. And he is Matt's friend. They've known each other forever. Foggy has been a character in Daredevil since the Silver Age. He's probably the character who's been around the longest in the story, other than Daredevil. I think he goes back to the very earliest appearances of Daredevil. I'm not certain when he first appeared, but you've got this budding romance between him and Gloria Breen. Now, Gloria is an Irish woman. She's been in the book for about 20 issues, I think, at this point. I don't know a whole lot else about her other than what's revealed in the story, but you've got this, as I think I just mentioned, a budding romance between her and Foggy at the same time that you have Matt going through this whole downward spiral, and Karen also kind of trying to come back from the low point in her life, at least up to this point. I'm not sure if she hits any other lows at any other point. And of course they intersect with Ben Urich, with Matt, with Karen Page at various times throughout this story. And then the fifth thread in this is the Kingpin. And the only bad guy in that I count in here, not that there aren't other bad guys, but he's the only one who really gets the spotlight at any point in a certain way. And it's really about his attempt to, he is determined to win this fight with Daredevil, even though he doesn't actually physically confront him very much in this story. There is one physical confrontation between the two, which comes very early on when Matt is desperate and doesn't know what else to do, and so he goes to the Kingpin's offices and attacks him, and which is in a way exactly what the Kingpin wanted, and it leads to probably there are so many good scenes in this story. There's so many good moments. I mean, almost every issue in this story has a good moment, at least by my standards. But as I was reading the story, as I said before, I wasn't 100% sure about where it was going at first, because it just seemed like Matt was in this downward spiral and he wasn't going anywhere. But it isn't until the last 2 pages of the second issue of issue 228 in this story that you get this moment where you see the Kingpin and this narration over the Kingpin, and this is after Matt has confronted the Kingpin and gotten really badly beaten by the Kingpin, physically beaten by the Kingpin. And the Kingpin is basically thinking, although there's no thought balloons, there's just narration, is thinking about what's going to happen to Matt Murdock, because he's got all these plans, and basically his plan is to kill him. And the ending line, because I'm not going to sit here and read all of those last 2 pages of that issue. The ending line is, and it's repeated 3 times, is "There is no corpse." And basically, he had it planned that Matt's body would be found, and it isn't found. And I was reading this. I do a lot of my reading on my train ride to work. I have a long train ride to the office. And I remember I was getting close to the office. I was still a few stops away, but I was getting close to the office. And I was standing on the train reading, and I remember reading those lines, "There is no corpse, there is no corpse, there is no corpse." And you get this close-up, and it keeps focusing in more and more on the Kingpin. And it's just, oh man, it was electric reading that. It was just, wow. And partly I think because I really didn't know what to expect up to that point, that I really hadn't had this story spoiled for me. I mean, I had read things about it in the past, but I really hadn't had it spoiled for me. And up to that point, I really hadn't been impressed. And all of a sudden, it was like this light went off. And honestly, there is a certain, and I don't know if Miller has ever admitted to this or how many people have seen this, but I mean, there is a certain Christ-like quality to the way the story, it's not the whole arc of the story, but the whole idea of being reborn. The idea that that Matt Murdock, that Daredevil, is somebody special, and that even though he can be destroyed, and he is destroyed in a sense at the beginning of the story, he comes back. And beyond that, there really is no comparison. But I still couldn't help but think about that. And I mean, there's another way. I mean, there are certain religious elements that enter into this later on when Matt's recovering. Part of his recovery is helped along by a nun named Sister Maggie. And I believe Matt Murdock is supposed to be Catholic. I'm not certain on that, but so I don't know. Just something that I thought was worth throwing out there. But as I was saying before, each issue is kind of its own little masterpiece, and there are great moments within each one. I think that the artwork is deceptively simple. I mean, Mazzucchelli just does great stuff. I really enjoyed his work on Batman Year One, and I thought his work here was as good, if not better. Now, unfortunately, the copy I bought it because it wasn't that expensive. It was a used copy, and this version is printed on some fairly shiny paper. I'm not that crazy about it. If I could find it, a good copy, a deluxe copy on some much nicer paper, some heavier paper, some, more paper that's not as slick, not as white, I think I would certainly consider buying it. I mean, the story speaks for itself. The story is just wonderful. I'm just not crazy about this particular paperback collection that I bought. Now, I understand that there is a hardbound, what do they call them, the artist edition of it, which is probably, if it's still available, I think it retailed for something like $150. I'm not ready to go that far. But if there's a better edition out there, I would certainly consider buying it. And this is a story I think I will want to reread at some point. I mean, it is just, it's so good. It is so well layered, and yeah. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit about the arc, I guess, of the story. And in talking about it, I'm mainly going to focus for the moment on Matt's arc. And so the first chapter, issue 227, is called Apocalypse. And this is where his identity is exposed and basically everything comes apart. And then in 228, Purgatory, you have Matt desperately attempting to get back on his feet. I mean, his apartment is destroyed at the end of the first part, and then he's almost killed at the end of the second part. And I talked about that scene with the Kingpin, and there is no corpse. And it just was so moving. The next issue, 229, is called Pariah. And this is where Matt has survived, and he's wandering the streets of New York, probably specifically of Hell's Kitchen, which is where he is from. Issue 230 is Born Again, which sees Matt physically recovering, and you also see life going on without him. Prior to this, you have seen bits and pieces of the stories of the other people that I mentioned, Ben Urich, Karen Page, Foggy and Glory, and the Kingpin. But you get a lot more of that in issue 230 because for the most part he's bedridden in this issue. Issue 231 is called Saved, and this is where Matt kind of secretly begins to reintegrate himself into the lives of the people he cares for. He's kind of in the shadows, not fully out in the open. Now, the last two issues are where it gets interesting and where there kind of is another thread introduced that I haven't mentioned before. So issue 232 is called God and Country. And in this one, Daredevil battles Nuke, who is a hired killer who wears the American flag on his face and fuels himself with drugs. He's taking blues and reds and whites, and he's somebody who works for the military, but is a hired killer, and the Kingpin hires him through his contacts. And I guess this would be a good point to bring up, and I could also mention this in the context of Ben Urich's arc or thread through this story, is that another big theme in this story is corruption, both police corruption and military corruption. First you get a lot of the police corruption, and then in the last two issues you get a lot of the military corruption. And this is obviously a theme that Miller dwells on quite a bit in this story. And then the final issue is called Armageddon. Now this is almost not a Daredevil issue, it's almost a Captain America issue. Daredevil plays a role in it, but it's really Captain America's issue. And this is where Captain America shows up and confronts Nuke, and then confronts the U.S. government, the people who hired him, because Nuke, of course, is somebody who's all hopped up on all these drugs. But there are people who are completely sober, who work in the government, who are behind him, people in the military, and possibly people higher than that. Now, there was one thing that happened in that issue which I thought was kind of funny. I mean, you've got to suspend your disbelief a little bit in these kinds of stories, but one of the things that comes up is, and I'm going to have to open this up and maybe read a line or two from it, where Nuke has been taken down, but Cap wants to find out what's this all about. And so he goes to, well, they don't specify exactly where it is that he goes to, but it's a military base somewhere, presumably in or near New York, and they show him at a computer, and it says he tries not to resent the computers only an old man would. He punches the keys and breaks the right codes and prays that he is wrong. And I thought that was funny, I mean, the idea of Captain America being the person, I mean, great, as big a hero as he is, I don't see him as the person who would be able to break into a computer system. Maybe Tony Stark, not Captain America. No, I'm sorry, but no. Somebody who's a man of the 40s who was born, I guess, probably in the 1920s, no. I'm sorry. But I was willing to suspend, I mean, for such a great story, I was willing to overlook that, but it still stuck out there. And so that last chapter in this Armageddon is, basically a really strong statement from it's not so much about Daredevil, but it's a really strong statement from Frank Miller, and I guess Mazzucchelli to a degree, about the U.S. government and about corruption and the misuse of power, and themes along those lines. Let's see. Let me turn to my notes now. I've gone through quite a bit of them, but I'm sure there's more that I want to say here. let's see. I mean, like I said, Ben Urich's arc is very interesting. I mean, he goes through an extreme amount of physical intimidation. Both himself and his wife is almost killed in this story, and it's a very good story. And you see him pushed to the point of desperation, and at one point he actually has to take matters into his own hands and stop being just the investigative reporter, but actually fight back because his life and the lives of the people around him are threatened. And I won't say anything more about that than that, but it's a great scene. And it's just one of many great action scenes in this story. I think that Mazzucchelli does a great job with these scenes. It's just, I mean, they're wonderful, whether it's that or there's a fake Daredevil that Matt has to fight in issue, well, it's either the third, or no, it must be the fourth or the fifth chapter. But, I mean, it's just the way the fights are drawn, he just, so energetic, so full of energy and force, and it's just wonderful. And I mean, the facial expressions, the weight, you can just feel them. What's happening? The motions, the actions. Let's see. Yeah, I mean, Matt versus the fake Daredevil, Daredevil versus Nuke, Cap versus Nuke, and then, as I mentioned before, Ben Urich versus the Crooked Cop. There's just so many great fight scenes in this story. And there's also some great moments with Glory. Glory, at first I'm not sure if she was supposed to be a photographer throughout this or not, but in some of the later chapters, she is working with Ben Urich. He's the reporter, and she's working as a photographer. And she's there when he has to lash out and take action in order to prevent them all from getting killed by this crooked cop. And she just keeps on taking pictures, and there's definitely something there about the way she shows care, almost no. She's almost careless in the way careless in the way when it comes to her own safety, she really puts herself in danger to get those pictures, and Mazzucchelli does a great job of showing that and showing how in the moment she is, and how there she is trying to get the picture and not caring about what might happen to her, both in that scene and also then when Daredevil is fighting Nuke on the streets of Hell's Kitchen. Let's see. Anything else? Yeah, I think I mentioned already that each issue is its own little masterpiece. It's got so many little twists and turns. At least somebody's story seems to have a moment in every issue that just brings it all home. Every issue, I didn't finish because I didn't sit down and read this straight through. That's not the way I read longer stories like this. I will read one chapter at a time, and I'll usually take a day or two between chapters. And I don't think there was a single time, other than maybe after the first chapter, where I was kind of left feeling like, less than satisfied with what I had just read, because I felt like I had really gotten a piece of something, and it wasn't just kind of an in-between chapter. I didn't think any of them were, except for maybe the first one, were kind of in-between chapters where the payoff would come down the road. Almost every chapter had some kind of payoff, at least to my mind. Well, the other thing I should mention about the artwork is there's a lot of great cityscapes here, like Miller did when he was drawing the book a few years before. there are lots of great shots of the city. There are lots of times whether it's a character posed in front of a cityscape with his back to the camera, or just narration over the cityscape. There are so many great moments in here, and Mazzucchelli and Miller really use the city as a setting, and it feels real, and it feels like an actual place. Whether it was exactly like that or not at that time, I don't know, but it definitely has a lived-in feel to it, and it doesn't feel like a place. It doesn't feel like a made-up place, and it also doesn't feel like these scenes could take place anywhere. They definitely feel like they're set in New York, in Hell's Kitchen, at this time in the mid to late 1980s. What did I say it was? This story came out in 1986. Yeah. In addition to the first chapter of Born Again, where I wasn't sure where the story was going, and I felt was a bit of a letdown, or I didn't feel like it took off right away. There was a couple other things that didn't work for me in this story, and these are things which I think other people have said, and in one case I know other people have said they found to be very impactful. I don't even know if that's really a word. Had a lot of impact, I guess. And the first of those events happens at the end of the third chapter. That would be issue 229. Oh, by the way, I know I listened back to what I recorded before, and I know that I said this was issues 227 to 223. It should be 227 to 233 is what was in my collection, the collection that I bought of Born Again. Anyway, back to this moment. What I wanted to say was that there's this moment at the end of the third chapter where the Kingpin is in his gym working out, and he says, "And I have shown him that a man without hope is a man without fear." And I've thought about that quite a bit. And that line really doesn't work for me. In one way, it sounds like it's backwards, because it seems more like he should be saying that a man without fear is a man without hope. That would make more sense to me. But on the other hand, it also kind of sounds like he's given up. It sounds like a man without hope is a man without fear. It's almost like I can't beat Daredevil is what he's saying. I don't know. I just think that probably Frank Miller, I don't know. I don't think that was very well written. I don't know. Or maybe he means something that I just don't understand. But I don't know. That just didn't work for me. And it sounds good when you read it. The words sound good. But just the sound of it. But it just, and invoking man without fear in there, which of course is Daredevil's nickname. But it just doesn't work for me. And just kind of left me shaking my head, wondering what Frank Miller really meant by that. Okay, the other point that I wanted to talk about, that I want to mention, it comes at the end of the fourth chapter, and that is the chapter in which Daredevil has been healing, has been in bed for the whole chapter. He's been taken care of by Sister Maggie, and out of nowhere, he asks her, "Are you my mother?" And she says, "Of course not, child." And he thinks, a heartbeat can tell you a lot. Hers just jumped, she's lying. And he's kind of smiling, and those are the last three panels of the chapter. And I don't know, I know some people that scene means a lot. For me, it didn't really do anything for me. I didn't really see how it connected to the rest of the story. Not that it necessarily needs to, but it just didn't seem like a natural outcome of what had been going along. It felt like one more thing being thrown in there. Now, I've done a little research, and it seems like she is his mother, even though, in my opinion, his heightened senses could fool him. Or at least, just because somebody's heartbeat jumped doesn't mean that they're lying. I guess is what I mean. Or what is she lying about? I mean, it just doesn't work for me. Anyway, it doesn't mean anything to me is what I mean, is what I'm trying to say. It didn't do anything for me, and I just felt like it was kind of thrown in there, and I don't know, maybe people with the idea that it would be meaningful, but there's so much good stuff in this book. You don't need that. You don't need that. Okay, anyway. And in my research, I did find a couple other things. For instance, that there's an issue. She has only appeared a few dozen times, couple dozen, in the 30 years, or almost 30 years since Daredevil Born Again came out in 1986. But one of the first appearances that she had, other than in Daredevil, in fact, I think the first appearance other than in Daredevil, was there was an issue of Amazing Spider-Man number 277 called Rules of the Game, which actually ties into Daredevil Born Again. Although, interestingly, because she appears in it, and Daredevil appears in it, and Kingpin appears in it. Now, I haven't read it. I don't have the issue. I don't know how significant of an appearance it is. Maybe it's just a one-page. But I do know that it has never been reprinted with Born Again. So maybe it's a tenuous connection. Maybe it's just like they were trying to sell people on Born Again, and so they put this little mention of it in this Spider-Man comic book. I don't know. And then just the other thing I wanted to say was that Frank Miller's first run on Daredevil was about 34 issues, the first 8 of which he was just drawing. Then he was, at first for a few issues there, he was writing it with David Michelini and drawing it, and then he was writing and drawing it for like the last 20 issues or so, entirely on his own. He wasn't just drawing it on. Klaus Janson was inking it, but the writing was all his own. And so that was from issues 158 to 191. There was one fill-in issue that he did not write or draw, and that was 162, and that was done by Steve Ditko. And then finally, and that's a great run. That's a great run. I have the trades. They're called Visionaries, Daredevil, Frank Miller, volumes 1, 2, and 3. I think there's even an omnibus, but I don't have that. But okay, so finally, I wanted to mention that Comic Geek Speak has been doing a series of episodes now and then over the past 6-8 months, I'm guessing, on Daredevil, because it's his 50th anniversary, I believe. Or I think 2014 was the 50th anniversary of the first appearance of Daredevil. 2014, that's what I said, I think. And they've done one on Frank Miller's first run and on the Bronze Age and the Silver Age Daredevil, and the next one is supposed to be on Born Again. Now, it was supposed to come out originally they advertised it as coming out in January. It's now the end of January, and it hasn't come out yet. Hopefully they will still do this soon. I'm eager to hear what they have to say and how they focus on it and what meaning they drew from it and what meant a lot to them in this story, because as I've said, there's just so much in this story. So on the whole, I'd say this is a complicated but excellently executed story. And if you're a Daredevil fan, if you're a comic book fan, if you're a Frank Miller fan, if you're a superhero fan, I'd say it's worth a read. It's certainly it's violent. It is an excellent read. Probably not something you'd want to give to a little kid, but I'd say it's something certainly a teenager could read. So I was very pleased with this. I have read a number of things over the last couple years that are supposed to be classics. Not all of them, or milestones at the very least. Not all of them felt that way as I read them, but this one definitely did. And this gets a strong recommendation from me. That's it for episode 63 of Dave Talks Comics. Dave Talks Comics can be found on the web at davetalkscomics.com. On Twitter at Dave Talks Comics. Email can be sent to davetalkscomics@gmail.com. If you're looking for more information on comics, then I recommend trying comicbookdb.com or comics.org. For a more complete listing of websites I use when preparing to record an episode of Dave Talks Comics, go to davetalkscomics.com and click on the links link near the top of the page. Next time on Dave Talks Comics, I will be diving back into the world of Who's Ohatmu. This will be part 2.2. I'm Dave. Thank you for listening.